Detective Dana Cross had spent 20 years chasing criminals, but the one thing she never managed to outrun was the system she worked for. At 42, she was known across the Oregon State Police for her cold precision, the detective who never smiled, never compromised, and never let a case rest until someone paid for the crime. Her colleagues called her Iron Dana, not because she was cruel, but because she carried a burden heavier than most. Years earlier, her younger brother had been consumed by a drug cartel that flooded the streets with poison. From that day on, she turned her grief into a weapon and swore she'd dismantle every network tied to the cartel. It wasn't ambition that drove her, it was fury disguised as discipline. By the fall of 1991, Dana had been working a case that brushed dangerously close to the same cartel her brother had fallen victim to. Whispers spread through the precinct that she'd found something big, something that could pull a few decorated officers down with it. But Dana didn't talk much. Her colleagues saw the exhaustion in her eyes and the way she'd stop mid-sentence, as if weighing every word. That week, she'd planned a short trip with two old friends, former detectives she'd once trusted, but a sudden work assignment forced her to delay her departure. She told them she'd meet them the next day at a remote cabin near Crater Lake. That was the last confirmed conversation anyone had with her. On the morning she left, the weather was oddly gray, the kind that blurs distance and time. Neighbors saw her pack light, a single duffel, her service pistol, and a brown notebook she carried everywhere. She seemed calm, focused, but something about her silence unsettled them. One neighbor later recalled how she stood by her car for nearly 5 minutes before driving off, staring at something invisible, as if her mind was replaying unfinished thoughts. Dana's car, a faded blue Ford sedan, rolled out of her driveway at 9:14 a.m. and vanished into the mountain roads. She never made it to the cabin. When she didn't arrive that evening, her friends assumed car trouble or a delayed stop at the station. It wasn't until the next morning that a quiet sense of dread began to spread. Her colleagues checked local motels, gas stations, and phone logs. Nothing. Dana had simply disappeared between 2 points on a familiar route she'd driven dozens of times. Her badge number was flagged, her radio frequencies searched, and her files sealed for internal review. Still, no trace. By the third day, the department called it a routine missing person case, though everyone knew it was more than that. A decorated detective, vanishing on her way to meet colleagues, wasn't routine. Behind closed doors, her partner whispered that she'd been working too close to something dangerous. Others claimed she'd gone rogue, hiding evidence, planning an expose against corrupt officers linked to cartel payoffs. But her family refused to believe any of it. To them, Dana was fearless, but not reckless. She'd faced death before. Never would she run from it. The official search for Detective Dana Cross began quietly, almost reluctantly, as though the department itself didn't want too much light on the case. Patrol units swept the back roads of southern Oregon, the dense forests around Crater Lake, and the winding trails that twisted into the Cascades. Helicopters circled for 2 days, but when fog rolled in, visibility dropped and the search was scaled back. Within a week, it was as if she had never existed. Her friends who'd gone ahead on the trip told investigators that Dana was supposed to meet them by late afternoon, yet she never showed. They waited through the night, thinking she might have stopped at a motel, but by sunrise, fear settled in. One of them, a retired detective named Mark Holden, drove down the highway, retracing every turn. No skid marks, no wreck, no sign of her blue Ford. It was as if she'd been swallowed by the forest itself. Rumors grew louder as weeks passed. Some said she'd uncovered names inside the department connected to cartel payoffs. Others whispered she'd been silenced for what she knew. Her sister, Lydia Cross, gave interviews insisting Dana had received threats before her disappearance, anonymous calls, a black sedan that followed her home twice. But the police dismissed these as paranoia, saying there was no proof. Still, the story leaked into small-town papers where headlines read, "Detective Missing After Secret Cartel Investigation." Those who worked with her began to feel the unease of knowing too much, and a few quietly requested transfers out of the narcotics division. Investigators found no evidence of foul play, yet nothing about the case added up. Her car didn't appear on any highway cameras, her credit cards were untouched, and her service pistol was missing. The only clue was a receipt from a gas station 30 miles from the meeting point, time-stamped at 11:42 a.m. Her signature on it, clear and steady. After that, nothing. Detectives traced the road between that gas station and the cabin, a route cutting through forests and abandoned logging areas, notorious for being cartel smuggling paths in the late 80s. Forensics teams later admitted parts of that region were off-limits during the search, blocked by private property restrictions that no one questioned too closely. Her family pushed for answers, but the investigation kept folding in on itself. Every lead vanished into red tape. Files were misplaced, phone logs went missing, and witnesses retracted statements. 10 months later, the case was officially labeled Unsolved Disappearance, presumed dead. The department moved on, promotions were handed out, and Dana's name became a quiet cautionary tale, spoken of in low tones by officers who knew better than to dig too deep. But her sister never accepted it. Every year, on the anniversary of Dana's disappearance, Lydia drove the same mountain road, placing flowers by the old trailhead where Dana was last seen on camera. It became a symbol of quiet defiance, one woman's stand against the silence of an entire system. And though most believed Dana Cross was gone forever, there were those who whispered that her story wasn't finished, that the truth was still out there, buried somewhere between those trees, waiting to be found. For almost 10 years, the name Dana Cross lingered like a forgotten file buried in the archives of the Oregon State Police. Her disappearance became one of those quiet cases people stopped mentioning aloud, not because they had answers, but because they'd learned to live with the absence of them. The department moved forward, faces changed, offices were repainted, and the detectives who once swore to find her slowly retired or transferred. Still, a few who remembered her found it difficult to shake the unease that came whenever her photograph appeared in the hallway of missing officers. Her stare in that framed picture seemed to ask a question no one wanted to answer. Outside the walls of law enforcement, her family refused to let the case die. Lydia Cross filed repeated requests for updates, forcing new detectives to reopen sections of the investigation each time. She appeared on small television interviews and talked about her sister's integrity, about how Dana's last months were spent investigating cartel-linked corruption. Her calm tone during those interviews concealed deep frustration. Each year she asked the same question: how could a police detective, traveling on a known route, simply vanish without a trace? No one ever offered a logical explanation. The official line was always the same: there wasn't enough evidence to prove foul play, and there wasn't enough proof to close the case either. By 1999, whispers began to return. A former sergeant anonymously contacted a journalist, hinting that evidence tied to Dana's investigation had been destroyed weeks before she disappeared. The journalist followed the lead, publishing a quiet piece in a local newspaper about systemic interference in a missing officer's case. It barely made the front page, but it rekindled something. Retired detectives came forward with their doubts. Some recalled seeing Dana arguing in the parking lot with another officer days before she vanished. Others claimed she'd received an envelope of documents that later went missing. But without physical proof, nothing moved forward. Her disappearance became a kind of legend in Oregon law enforcement, a story new recruits whispered about in bars after late shifts. They said Dana had uncovered the wrong kind of truth, that she'd paid the price for loyalty in a world where silence was currency. Even those who didn't believe in conspiracies admitted the case felt off. Too many missing reports, too many lost files, too much indifference. Lydia kept pressing, writing letters to senators, the governor, even federal offices, demanding intervention. But bureaucracy always had a polite way of declining. By the start of 2001, time had eroded most hope. The Cross family home was quiet now, her parents gone, Lydia living alone with boxes of Dana's old case notes stacked like relics in the corner. She'd begun to think the truth would never surface, that her sister's story had been buried for good. Then one cold January morning, she received a call from a ranger near the Klamath National Forest. A vehicle had been found deep inside restricted woodland, rusted, half swallowed by vines and moss. The license plate was barely visible, but it matched the one Lydia had memorized years ago. Oregon State 3C9712. The car belonged to Detective Dana Cross. The day Dana Cross's car was found, the sky hung low with winter haze, the kind that muffles every sound and makes the world feel paused. Rangers had been surveying an off-limits section of the Klamath National Forest when they noticed something odd beneath a curtain of ivy and fallen branches. It looked like the curve of an old fender, metal, eaten by rust. When they cleared the overgrowth, they saw the faded blue of a vehicle long forgotten, its tires sunk deep into the soil. The tag was barely legible, but when they read it aloud over the radio, the silence that followed was heavy. 10 years of unanswered questions began to stir again. The vehicle, confirmed by records, belonged to Detective Dana Cross, missing since September 1991. Within hours, police units and forensic teams sealed off the area, and the once quiet forest came alive with floodlights, cameras, and whispers. Inside the car, time had done its damage. The front windshield was shattered inward, the doors warped, and the steering wheel still bore faint fingerprints fossilized in dust. On the passenger seat lay a torn brown notebook, its pages damp but legible in places. Lists of dates, addresses, and a few names circled in red ink. Beneath the driver's seat, they found a fragment of a badge, half bent and darkened by age. But the most disturbing find was in the trunk, a decayed piece of fabric later identified as Dana's jacket, and beside it, fragments of human remains. Forensics expected closure, but the analysis complicated everything. The bones didn't match Dana's DNA. The remains belonged to someone else entirely, an unidentified male, mid-30s, with no criminal record or missing person report on file. It was as though her final clue had been left deliberately to confuse the truth. The press swarmed the scene once the discovery leaked. The department held a brief statement, promising transparency, but their tone carried the same mechanical detachment that had followed the case for years. Reporters demanded answers. How did a detective's car end up in a part of the forest supposedly sealed by logging companies? Why had no one searched there before? Officials insisted the terrain had been too unstable at the time. But those who had known Dana doubted that explanation. A former partner told a journalist that Dana had once mentioned safe houses the cartel used in those woods, abandoned after federal crackdowns. If her car ended up there, it wasn't by accident. Evidence processing revealed more contradictions. The keys were still in the ignition, but the fuel gauge showed half a tank. There were no signs of a crash, no broken bones from impact. The trunk latch appeared to have been forced open from the outside. Someone had placed the jacket and bones inside after the car was already abandoned. The notebook, once dried and restored, contained one phrase written twice on the back cover. Not all of them wear badges. Investigators refused to comment on it publicly, calling it irrelevant. But privately, agents admitted the words matched the tone of a whistleblower ready to expose corruption. As forensic teams worked, Lydia Cross stood behind the police tape watching the scene from a distance. 10 years of grief collided with disbelief. She'd imagined this moment countless times, hoping for closure, but what she saw only deepened the wound. When an officer handed her Dana's rusted badge fragment, she didn't cry. She simply asked where the rest of her sister was. The detective in charge avoided her eyes and muttered that the search would continue, though everyone there knew how it would end. Within days, theories flooded the media. Some said Dana was killed by the cartel. Others believed she'd been silenced by her own department to bury evidence of police collusion. Online forums obsessed over the detail of the bones, questioning whether the man in the trunk had been part of her case or a witness who suffered the same fate. Still, nothing connected cleanly. The case that had haunted Oregon for a decade had resurfaced, but instead of clarity, it delivered only another layer of confusion. The forest had given something back, but it wasn't the truth. It was a reminder that whoever had buried Dana Cross's story still held the final piece. After the discovery of Dana Cross's car, the investigation reignited like a fire that had been waiting for oxygen. The state reopened the case, forming a special task force made up of detectives too young to have worked with Dana, but old enough to know her story. They began with the notebook, the red-circled names, the cryptic notes, and that haunting phrase scrawled on the last page. Several of the names were traced to individuals connected to an undercover narcotics operation that went dark months before her disappearance. One belonged to a sergeant who'd retired suddenly in 1992 and moved out of state. Another to a businessman once accused of laundering money for a cartel-linked trucking firm. As investigators dug deeper, files that should have been archived were gone, and witness reports from that period had been quietly deleted. Every clue seemed to lead into an empty room, as though someone had cleaned the trail long before they ever arrived. Lydia Cross refused to stay silent. She held press conferences, demanding federal involvement and accusing the Oregon State Police of covering up her sister's murder. When she spoke, her voice carried the calm rage of a woman who had spent a decade being ignored. "My sister trusted the badge," she said once on national television, "and the badge betrayed her." Public pressure grew, forcing the department to respond. A new chief promised transparency, though privately he warned his team to tread carefully. Some of the names in Dana's notes had friends in high places. Meanwhile, independent journalists began to investigate, digging through old narcotics cases, tracing property records, and interviewing anyone who'd worked with Dana in her final weeks. What they uncovered painted a chilling picture. She'd been preparing to expose a network of officers, businessmen, and middlemen who funneled seized narcotics back onto the streets through fake evidence disposal. It was a system that thrived on silence, and Dana had been the first to break it. The remains found in her trunk were eventually identified as belonging to a missing informant named Luis Ortega, who vanished 2 weeks before Dana. Ortega had been one of her key witnesses, a man who claimed to have information linking the cartel to a few senior officers. When his name surfaced, the department issued a short statement calling it a tragic coincidence. But for those who knew Dana's work, it was no coincidence. It was confirmation that her last case had crossed the wrong lines. The fact that both their fates ended in the same forest only deepened suspicion that someone inside law enforcement had orchestrated the cover-up. As pressure mounted, retired officers began to talk off-record. One, whose voice trembled during an interview, admitted he'd been ordered to halt Dana's search prematurely back in '91. Another revealed that evidence from her desk, audio tapes, surveillance notes, and coded files, had been seized by Internal Affairs the day after she disappeared, yet no official record of that seizure existed. These revelations reached the media, igniting outrage across the state. For a brief moment, it felt like the truth might finally surface. But just as momentum built, key witnesses retracted their statements. Documents disappeared again. A week later, the journalist leading the investigation was found in a single car accident. It was the same type of disappearance story Dana herself had once tried to solve. The task force eventually disbanded without resolution. The state closed the case citing lack of sufficient evidence, despite the public's belief that corruption had buried the truth. Lydia's final appeal to the Justice Department went unanswered. She spent her remaining years living near the same forest that had swallowed her sister, convinced that somewhere beneath its roots still lay the missing pieces. In her journal, she wrote, "They took her body, but they couldn't erase her story." That line became the last entry she ever made. Today, the remains of Dana Cross's car sit in a police storage facility under a weathered tarp, rust spreading like decay on memory. Her badge fragment rests in a display case at a small local museum, a symbol of courage that cost more than it should have. Visitors who read her story often leave with more questions than answers. Who killed Detective Dana Cross, and why did so many people want her forgotten? The forest remains untouched, and locals claim that on certain quiet nights, if the wind passes through the trees just right, you can still hear the faint echo of a woman's voice on the radio, repeating her last message. Not all of them wear badges. No one knows whether she was silenced to protect power, to preserve an image, or to erase the truth altogether. What remains certain is that Dana Cross became more than a missing detective. She became a symbol of what happens when justice dares to challenge its own reflection. Her case, officially closed but never solved, still haunts the files of every officer who's read it. Because deep down, they all understand what her last message meant. The monsters she hunted weren't hiding in alleys or behind masks. They were standing beside her, wearing the same uniform, waiting for the moment she got too close. Years passed after the case was declared closed, yet Detective Dana Cross's name continued to resurface in quiet corners of Oregon's justice system, like a wound that refused to heal. The public had moved on, but within certain circles of retired officers and investigative journalists, her story was still whispered about in late-night conversations. Theories evolved with time. Some said she was buried in the forest where her car was found. Others believed she'd escaped before they reached her, living somewhere under another name. But one theory, buried deep in a handful of files marked classified, hinted at something far darker, that her own department had staged her disappearance to protect a criminal operation that never really ended. The problem was, no one could prove it. Every piece of evidence that could have connected Dana's investigation to the cartel or her fellow officers had been destroyed, rewritten, or filed under cases that no longer existed. In 2005, a young detective named Miles Hanley, recently transferred to the Cold Case Division, stumbled across the Cross file while reviewing old internal investigations. It was supposed to be a routine review, yet something about the contradictions pulled him in. The timeline didn't add up. Her vehicle logs were inconsistent, the evidence submission sheets were missing signatures, and the final forensic report on the bones found in her car had been amended twice by different analysts. When he asked about it, his supervisor told him not to waste his time on a dead detective and a dead story. But Hanley couldn't let it go. He started digging quietly, contacting retired officers who had worked the original case. Most refused to talk, and those who did sounded afraid. One told him bluntly, "Son, that case already buried more than one career. Don't let it bury yours." Hanley pressed on. Late one night, while scanning microfilm archives at a local paper, he found a small article published in 1991 that mentioned Dana's last known case number. When he cross-referenced it with official police databases, the number led nowhere. It had been wiped. But a backup record in an old narcotics registry revealed it was connected to a covert operation named Winterglass, an intelligence sweep targeting a suspected alliance between law enforcement and a cartel network along the Oregon-California corridor. Dana had been the lead investigator assigned to verify evidence tampering within her own department. The deeper Hanley looked, the clearer it became that her disappearance wasn't random, it was planned. One evening, he received an unmarked envelope slipped under his apartment door. Inside was a single photograph of Dana standing beside her car, talking to a man whose face was half obscured by shadow. On the back of the photo was written, "She found the ledger." The same week, Hanley's office computer was wiped clean overnight, and his access to archived case files was revoked. The message was clear: someone was still watching. He documented everything by hand, storing copies off-site, determined to finish what Dana had started. When he finally tracked down a retired forensic technician from 1991, the man admitted something he'd never told anyone. The bones found in Dana's car had been switched. The original remains, believed to be hers, were taken before testing and replaced with those of the unidentified male. The technician never saw who authorized it, but remembered the same 3 letters stamped on the request form: IAD, Internal Affairs Division. By 2008, Hanley had gathered enough fragments to understand what happened. Dana had uncovered proof that a handful of senior officers were funneling confiscated narcotics back into distribution through fake busts, making millions in payoffs. When she confronted one of them, they orchestrated her removal under the guise of a missing persons case. The forest wasn't an accident. It was chosen because it was part of a land parcel once owned by a shell company tied to the same cartel. Dana's car had been left as a warning, a message to anyone else who might dig too deep. But Hanley never had the chance to reveal his findings publicly. A week after sending an encrypted email to a journalist, his apartment burned down in what authorities ruled as an electrical accident. All his files were destroyed. The story should have ended there, yet months later, that same journalist received a package in the mail. Inside was a copy of Dana's notebook, perfectly preserved, along with a flash drive labeled "Her Truth." It contained recordings of police briefings, voice memos, and an unfinished statement written in Dana's handwriting. Her final words were simple: "If I disappear, tell them to look within the walls they built." To this day, the files have never been officially authenticated, but the contents align too precisely with what Hanley uncovered. They revealed that Dana Cross's last investigation was not just about corruption, it was about betrayal from within, a rot so deep it survived long after she vanished. Now, decades later, the name Dana Cross still carries weight in whispered conversations among those who know the system's darker corners.